They found him in the snow with his hands bound behind his back. No phone, no signal, no one coming. The temperature had dropped to -18. The storm was still building. And the men who left him there, they weren't amateurs. They'd done this before. They knew how mountains work. They knew how cold works. They just didn't know him. What happened next on Silverpine Ridge would expose a conspiracy so deep it reached the halls of federal government. And it started with one man who refused to die in the dark. If this story hits you, follow along, hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The dogs found him first. That was the thing nobody talked about later, when the news crews arrived and the federal agents started drawing chalk lines around evidence in the snow. Everyone wanted to talk about the documents, the explosives, the arrested billionaire in his tailored coat being walked to a black SUV on camera. Nobody mentioned that if Kodiak and Ranger hadn't stayed beside Gavin Cross through 18 hours of sub-zero darkness, he would have been dead long before any of it mattered. But that comes later. Start here. A man alone on a mountain, hands zip-tied behind his back, face pressed into the snow. Alive, but only technically. Gavin Cross was 39 years old and had survived things that should have killed him multiple times over. 2 combat deployments in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq that nobody officially acknowledged, a helicopter crash in the Korangal Valley that took 3 members of his team and left him with a fractured pelvis, a ruptured eardrum, and a scar along his left jaw that had never quite faded the way the doctors said it would. He'd come home from all of that. He'd left the Navy after 12 years, declined the counseling sessions the VA offered, packed what fit in a truck, and driven until he ran out of reasons to keep going. He'd ended up on Silverpine Ridge, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was his grandfather's land and nobody else wanted it. 43 acres of high-altitude wilderness in the San Juan Range of Colorado, ponderosa pine and lodgepole, rocky creek beds that ran clear in spring, elk trails that cut through the undergrowth at angles only old animals know. No cell service above the first ridge. The nearest town, Harlan, was 11 miles of unpaved road that became genuinely impassable in deep winter. He'd lived up there for 4 years without incident. Him, the land, and 2 Belgian Malinois he'd adopted from a military working dog retirement program. Kodiak, 7 years old, with a torn left ear and a temperament like a loaded spring, and Ranger, younger by 2 years, quicker, and possessed of an almost eerie capacity for silence. It was a quiet life. Not a happy one, necessarily, but quiet, which for Gavin was close enough. The trouble started 18 months before the night they left him in the snow. The first man who came up the ridge road arrived in a silver Range Rover with Colorado plates and a sport coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had the kind of face that had been professionally maintained, not handsome exactly, but arranged, controlled. The face of someone who'd learned that confidence, performed at the right volume, substituted for almost anything. His name was Derek Fenn. He said he represented Halden Development Group. Gavin had listened to the pitch from the porch steps, arms folded, saying nothing. The dog sat beside him and watched the man with the calm, focused attention of animals that had been trained to decide whether something was a threat. Fenn had talked for 9 minutes. Resort development, eco-luxury. Harmonizing with the natural landscape, a phrase that had apparently been workshopped. He quoted a purchase offer that was, objectively, more money than Gavin would see in 3 lifetimes of anything. When he finished, Gavin looked at him for a moment. No. Fenn blinked. Mr. Cross, I don't think you understand the scale. I understood you fine. Answer's no. Perhaps if you took some time to... I'm not going to take time. Gavin stood up from the steps. You drove 90 minutes to get here. I'd head back before the light changes. Road gets bad fast. Fenn left. The Range Rover disappeared around the first bend in the road, and Gavin watched the dust settle and felt the particular quality of silence that follows a thing that isn't finished yet. He was right to feel it. The second visit wasn't a visit. It was a letter, delivered through a law firm in Denver, outlining what appeared to be a historical dispute over the property boundary. Gavin's grandfather had filed the original deed in 1961. The letter claimed a surveying error from that same year had miscategorized a significant portion of the acreage. Gavin drove to Harlan, Found the one lawyer in town who handled property matters, a 60-year-old woman named Patricia Deere who ran her practice out of the back of a building that also housed a tax preparation service, and spent 2 hours going through the documents. "It's garbage," Patricia said, not looking up from the pages. "This surveying claim has no foundation. Your grandfather's deed is clean. So why send it?" She looked at him over her reading glasses. "Because most people panic when they get a letter from a law firm. They think they're going to lose and settle for whatever's offered. I'm not most people." "No," she said, setting the papers down. "But Gavin, these are serious people. Halden's companies have acquired 47 properties in this county in the last 3 years. 45 of those were originally held by people who said they'd never sell." He drove home. He checked his perimeter. He added 2 motion sensor cameras he'd ordered online to the tree line at the eastern approach, the one that provided best concealment for anyone coming up from the service road. Old habits. The third visit happened at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, 8 months before the night he ended up in the snow. Gavin was awake when they came. He usually was, somewhere between 1 and 4, that stretch of night that had never quite become friendly since the deployment years. He heard Kodiak first, a low sound that wasn't quite a bark, more a vibration in the chest. Ranger was already on his feet. Gavin pulled on boots and a jacket, took the rifle from the rack beside the door, a Remington 700, bolt action, nothing tactical about it, just a hunting rifle that he kept because this was bear country, and went out through the back. 3 men, moving through the eastern tree line, maybe 60 yards out, using lights that kept low and aimed at the ground. Not professionals. The spacing was wrong. They were bunching on the approach, and at least one of them was moving with the specific awkwardness of someone who'd done their training on flat ground and was struggling with the slope. Gavin let them come to within 40 yards, then clicked on the porch light. The 3 men froze like deer. "You're trespassing," Gavin said. His voice was level. He wasn't shouting. "Whatever you came here to do, it's not worth it. Walk back down to the road." A long pause. The men looked at each other. One of them, the one on the left, made a gesture that Gavin read as "should we," and the one in the middle shook his head. They retreated. He watched them go, tracking their movement by sound until the engine of a vehicle on the service road started and faded south. He didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat at the kitchen table and did what he used to do before operations. Ran scenarios, exit routes, choke points, vulnerabilities. His land had one good approach from the south, one from the east, and the northern face was essentially impassable in winter. He had stored food, water, a generator, medical supplies. He had a shortwave radio that could reach the county sheriff's frequency. What he didn't have was documentation. And against people with lawyers and money and patience, that was the only thing that actually mattered. He started keeping records, every incident logged in a notebook, time-stamped, with whatever physical evidence he could photograph. He called the sheriff's office and filed a formal complaint about the late-night trespass, which generated a report that he suspected would go nowhere. Sheriff Len Braddock was a decade from retirement and operated on the principle that problems between private citizens were best resolved by private citizens. "Gavin," Braddock had said on the phone, with the weariness of a man who'd had this conversation many times, "did anyone actually damage your property? Not yet. Did anyone threaten you directly? Not in a way you could put in an affidavit, no. Then I can file a report, which I will. But I need you to understand what that report is going to accomplish. File it anyway." He filed it. 6 weeks later, someone cut the power line that ran from the utility pole at the base of the ridge to his cabin. The repair took 3 days and cost him $800. He photographed the cut line. It was clean, deliberate, not weather damage, and drove to the sheriff's office in person. Braddock looked at the photo. He looked at Gavin. He looked at the photo again. "Could have been anything," he said. "It was cut with lineman's shears. You can see the angle." "I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm saying proving who did it is a different thing." He leaned back in his chair. "You know what I'd do if I were you? I'd think hard about whether holding on to that land is worth—" Gavin had left before Braddock finished the sentence. Oh, the months that followed had a grinding quality to them. Not dramatic, just slow, sustained pressure applied from multiple directions simultaneously. The kind of campaign that was designed not to break you suddenly, but to exhaust you into compliance. Legal letters. A zoning complaint filed with the county that claimed his cabin's foundation violated updated building codes, a complaint that turned out to be baseless but took 4 months to formally dismiss. His road access was briefly blocked by what was logged as a county infrastructure project that lasted exactly as long as it needed to in order to delay a supply delivery he was waiting on. A rumor spread through Harlan that Gavin Cross had mental health problems, that he was unstable, that the deployment years had left him dangerous. He heard the last one from Patricia Deere, who called to tell him about it with the careful, precise tone of someone delivering information they wish they didn't have. "People are saying it," she said. "I want you to know." "Who's saying it?" "It's diffuse. That's the point. Nobody you can confront directly." He sat with the phone pressed to his ear and stared out the cabin window at the ridgeline. Snow had come early that year, first week of October, and the pines were already heavy with it. "Patricia, am I going to lose this?" A pause that lasted just long enough to feel honest. "Not if you can find something they don't want found," she said. "Something on the record that connects the pressure to Halden directly. Right now, all you have is a pattern. Patterns are hard to prosecute." He thanked her and hung up. He sat alone in the cabin with the 2 dogs pressed against him on either side, and the wind coming down off the ridge, and thought about what she'd said. Evidence. Something on the record. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't an investigator. He was a former SEAL who knew how to clear buildings and read terrain and stay alive in bad conditions. But he'd spent 12 years gathering intelligence in places where the wrong piece of information got people killed. He knew what a paper trail looked like. He knew how systems tried to hide themselves. He just needed time. He didn't know that time was the one thing they'd already decided not to give him. The night they came for him properly was November 14th. He remembered the date because he'd noted it in the log. He remembered the conditions because conditions had always been the first thing he cataloged. It was how the training embedded itself, automatic, like breathing. Temperature, -11 Celsius and dropping. Wind, 15 to 20 knots from the northwest with gusts. Visibility, severely reduced by snow that had been falling since mid-afternoon and was now falling with intent. He'd gone out to check the eastern cameras at 2200 hours. One of them had stopped transmitting at around 2145, and the most likely explanation was ice accumulation on the sensor housing. It had happened before, but the second most likely explanation was that someone had disabled it, and in his experience you planned for the second most likely, not the first. He took the rifle. He took the dogs. He wore thermals under his canvas work jacket, wool hat, insulated gloves, and the boots he wore in genuine cold. Serious footwear, not the mid-range hiking variety. He had a headlamp and a handheld radio set to the county emergency frequency, though at that range and in those conditions, the radio was mostly psychological comfort. Kodiak moved out front at 15 yards. Ranger worked the right flank, in the trees, visible as a dark shape moving through the snow when Gavin angled his headlamp that direction. The camera was at the edge of the property, mounted on a ponderosa at about 7 feet elevation, aimed back at the approach from the service road. He found it with no trouble. The housing was clear. The sensor was functioning. The transmission fault had been not ice. The camera had been manually rotated. Someone had turned it 60 degrees on its mount so that it was pointing into the bark of the tree instead of down the approach. Gavin had approximately 2 seconds to process that information. Then something hit him from behind. He came down hard and fast, and the rifle went into the snow, and there were hands on him immediately. More than 2, which meant more than one person, and they were working together with enough coordination that this wasn't the first time. His right arm was wrenched behind him before he could get his elbow into the position he needed. A knee went into his lower back with enough force to drive the air out of his lungs, and before he could recover, they had both arms secured. He fought it. Trained response, muscle memory, tuck the chin, drop the weight, try to create enough movement to break the grip. But there were 3 of them, and one of them hit him across the back of the head with something blunt. Not enough to lose consciousness, but enough to make the next few seconds blurry at the edges. Zip ties. He heard the sound before he felt them. That specific ratcheting click. And then his wrists were secured behind his back, and the fight changed from escape to assess. "Dogs," someone said. One of them went for Kodiak. There was a struggle in the dark. Gavin heard it without being able to see it, which was its own specific horror. And then a short, sharp yelp that ended too fast. "Stop!" The voice that said it was calm. Not aggressive, not excited. The voice of someone accustomed to being in charge of things. "That's enough. Leave them. They'll follow. Let them follow. It doesn't matter." They walked him north, into the tree line, away from the cabin, up the slope that angled toward the secondary ridge. The snow was knee-deep in places, and they moved through it with the kind of slow, grinding effort that punished everyone equally, Gavin included, stumbling with his hands behind his back, trying to keep his footing on terrain he knew better than any of them, but couldn't navigate properly without his arms. It took 40 minutes to reach the place they'd chosen. A clearing, a natural bowl in the ridge sheltered from the wind on three sides by rock face and old growth. Invisible from the service road or the cabin or anywhere a search, if one ever came, would think to look first. The snow had drifted in the bowl and was thigh-high at the edges. They pushed him to his knees. The calm-voiced man crouched in front of him. He was wearing a balaclava, but the build was wrong for any of the three men Gavin had watched come up the east approach 8 months ago. Professional. Measured. "Mr. Cross," the man said, "you've been difficult." Gavin said nothing. "The offer on the table is still the offer on the table, but I need you to understand something." He let a moment pass. "Nobody is coming up here looking for you. You understand that? The story is already written. Reclusive veteran, mountain living. These things end a certain way sometimes." The man stood. He looked at Gavin for a moment, clinically, without malice, which was somehow worse than malice. "The temperature is going to do the work," he said. "There won't be anything to find by spring." They left. 4 of them, moving south through the tree line, and within 3 minutes Gavin couldn't hear them anymore over the wind. The cold came immediately. It wasn't a gradual thing. The exertion of the walk had kept his core temperature up, and the moment he stopped moving, it dropped. The snow beneath his knees began to feel less cold, which was a bad sign. He pulled against the zip ties and found them solid, commercial grade, the thick kind, not the cheap ones that broke with enough pressure applied at the right angle. He worked his hands anyway, systematically. He found the tab by feel and started applying rotational stress to the locking mechanism, the way the instructors at BUD/S had taught him 1,000 years ago, though that technique worked better with thinner ties and his hands were already losing dexterity to the cold. The dogs found him 20 minutes later. He heard Ranger first, the particular pattern of movement he'd learned over 3 years, the way the dog picked up and set down his feet in deep snow. Then Kodiak, limping on the left rear leg but moving, and the animal pressed itself against Gavin's side and Gavin felt the heat of it like something sacred. He kept working the ties. His fingers were wrong by now, distant, like they belonged to someone else. But he kept working, because the man in the balaclava had made one miscalculation. He'd planned for a man who was broken, exhausted, ready to be done. He didn't know Gavin Cross had been in worse places than this. Not many, but worse. The snow was still falling, the temperature was still dropping, and somewhere in the forest below him, a set of headlights appeared on the service road, a vehicle moving up the ridge in weather that nobody sane would choose to drive in, its beams cutting thin and pale through the wall of white. Gavin stared at those lights and felt something that wasn't quite hope. He didn't know who it was. He didn't know if they'd find him. He didn't know if he'd still be alive when they did. But something was moving. Something was coming up the mountain. And then the lights stopped. And for a long moment, nothing. And then the lights went out entirely. The lights went out and the mountain went completely dark. Gavin kept his eyes on the spot where the headlights had been, a point roughly 300 meters south-southwest, just past the first switchback on the service road, and tried to read the absence of light the way he'd been trained to read it. Not panic. Information. Someone had killed their lights intentionally, which meant they were either retreating or they didn't want to be seen. If they were retreating, he was going to die up here. If they didn't want to be seen, there was someone else on this mountain they were hiding from. He kept working the zip tie with fingers that were no longer entirely his. Kodiak pressed harder against his left side, the dog's body heat doing something. Not enough, but something. Ranger had positioned himself slightly uphill, facing south, ears pitched forward, tracking whatever was moving in the dark below. The snow had slowed marginally. The wind hadn't. 6 minutes passed. He counted them by estimating breath cycles, which was imprecise but better than nothing. Then a light came on. Not headlights this time. A handheld flashlight, lower to the ground, moving through the trees on foot and moving fast, faster than anyone unfamiliar with that terrain should have been moving in those conditions. Whoever it was, they were following the tracks he'd made on the way up. His tracks, and the tracks of the 3 men who'd walked him here. He considered shouting, rejected it immediately. If those men were still within earshot, and they could be, they'd only had a 6-minute head start. Announcing his location was the last thing he wanted to do. So he watched, and waited, and kept working the tie even though his hands were past useful now, more reflex than purpose. The light came into the clearing at an angle from the southeast, which told him whoever was holding it had deviated from the direct line to avoid the open ground near the rock face. That wasn't luck. That was someone who understood exposure. The beam swept and found him. He squinted into it. A woman's voice clipped, slightly breathless from the climb. "Are you Gavin Cross?" He didn't answer immediately. Old training, verify before you commit to anything. "Who's asking?" "My name is Elena Voss." She was moving toward him already, not waiting for permission. "I'm a journalist. I was on the service road when I saw them bring you up here." She stopped 2 feet in front of him, flashlight angled to the side now, not in his eyes. She was in her mid-30s, dark hair plastered against her forehead from the snow, wearing a coat that was decent but not built for this temperature. A camera bag over one shoulder, an expression that was trying hard to stay controlled and not quite succeeding. "They use zip ties?" "Commercial grade, left front pocket. Most people carry a knife in—" She was already reaching into her jacket, pulling out a folding knife. A small thing, not much, but the blade was sharp and she cut through the tie in one clean stroke, and Gavin's arms came forward and the pain that followed was immediate and serious. He made a sound he hadn't planned on making. "How long?" she asked. 40-some minutes. He was already trying to flex his hands, force circulation back. It felt like pressing on a bruise the size of his whole arm. "Don't rub them, just let them hang." "I know." She was looking at his hands with the expression of someone doing an assessment. "Can you walk?" "Yes." He wasn't entirely sure that was true, but he was going to make it true. He pushed up from his knees and the world tipped briefly, and he put a hand on the Ponderosa beside him and steadied. Kodiak pressed against his leg. "My rifle." "I didn't see a rifle." "They took it. Of course they did." "Okay." He looked at the tree line to the south, listened. "We need to move. Not back to the cabin." "Why not?" "Because the cabin is the obvious place, and I don't know if they're watching it." Elena looked at him for a moment, the kind of look that was recalibrating something. "You know this mountain better than they do?" "Significantly." "Then where?" He thought for exactly 3 seconds. "There's a hunting cabin. North face, about 1.5 miles. My grandfather built it in the 60s. It's not on any deed I know of, and it's not something you'd find on a satellite map because the tree cover's too dense." 1.5 miles, she said. Flat. Not complaining exactly, but acknowledging the reality. "In current conditions, 45 minutes. Maybe an hour." She looked at the dogs. Kodiak's rear left leg was still wrong. He was weight shifting, keeping it elevated when he could. Ranger was watching the tree line. Elena looked back at Gavin and nodded once. "Lead the way," she said. They didn't talk much on the climb. The terrain didn't allow for it. The north face was steep in sections, and the snow was deep enough in the unprotected stretches that moving through it demanded a physical commitment that left little room for conversation. Gavin set the pace, which was slower than he wanted because his core temperature was still recovering and his hands, coming back to life, went through a period of pain that he dealt with by focusing on his footfalls and nothing else. Elena kept up. She wasn't effortless about it. She fell twice, once catching herself on a root, once going down on one knee in a drift. But she got up both times without comment and kept moving. She was also, Gavin noticed, scanning. Not looking at the ground or at her feet. Looking outward, at the tree line, at the angles of approach, like someone who'd learned to be aware of her environment in places where being unaware had consequences. He filed that away. The cabin appeared through the trees as a dark shape against the snow, low and square, set back into the hillside in a way that made it almost part of the landscape. His grandfather had built it into the slope deliberately, using the earth as insulation. The door faced east, away from the prevailing wind. The single window faced south, downhill, with a long sight line through the trees. The old man had known what he was doing. Gavin found the key under the third stone to the left of the door frame, the same place it had been for 60 years, and got the door open. Inside, dust, the smell of old wood and cold air, a cast-iron stove in the corner, a metal cot with a rolled sleeping bag on top of it, a wooden shelf holding matches, candles, 2 tins of food of indeterminate age, and a wool blanket folded on a hook. He got the stove going with the wood stacked beside it. His hands were clumsy with the matches, and it took 3 tries, which annoyed him, but the fire caught, and within 10 minutes the interior temperature had begun its slow climb toward survivable. Elena sat on the floor near the stove with her knees drawn up and her camera bag in her lap. She unzipped it and checked the camera C-OS inside. A professional-grade body, a fixed lens, a cracked protective filter on the front. She worked the controls, checked the display, exhaled slowly. "How bad?" Gavin asked. "Filter's cracked. Body looks okay." She scrolled through the images on the display, her expression unreadable. "I was shooting from the tree line below the service road. I have the vehicles. I have 3 of them coming back down." She paused on something, showed him the display. 3 figures. Night mode grain, motion blur on the edges, but faces clear enough on 2 of them. Men he didn't recognize. And behind them, barely visible, a 4th figure near the vehicles. "Can you sharpen that?" He pointed at the 4th figure. "Not here. Maybe on a proper screen." She lowered the camera. "I saw them bring you out of the cabin. I followed at distance. I didn't know if—" She stopped. Started again. "I didn't know if you were already dead." Gavin looked at her steadily. "Why were you on my mountain at 11 o'clock at night in a snowstorm?" A beat. She looked into the stove. "I've been investigating Halden Development Group for 14 months, she said. "I tracked 3 separate land acquisitions in this county that all followed the same pattern: legal harassment, infrastructure disruption, reputation attacks, and all 3 previous owners sold within 18 months of the campaign starting. You're the 4th. She glanced at him. "You're also the first one who didn't sell. You could have called me." "I tried, twice. Your neighbor in Harlan said you didn't take calls from people you didn't know." That was accurate, and under normal circumstances, correct policy. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" "I did." Her voice had a flatness that carried a specific kind of history in it. 14 months ago, I took what I had to the Denver field office of the FBI. They told me the evidence wasn't sufficient to open an investigation." She paused. 6 weeks later, my editor at the paper killed the story, said the sourcing was thin. He's been at that paper for 22 years and he's never killed a story for thin sourcing. Gavin absorbed that. The stove ticked and popped as the metal expanded from the heat. Kodiak had settled against his right side, the injured leg stretched out, breathing steadily. Ranger was at the door, still listening. "Victor Halden," Gavin said. "Yes. Tell me what you actually know, not what you suspect, what you can document." She opened the camera bag and produced a folded waterproof envelope. Inside were printed documents, wrinkled and slightly damp at the edges, and a USB drive. She spread the papers on the floor between them and started talking. Not like a journalist running a pitch, like someone who'd lived inside a subject long enough that the information had reorganized itself in their mind into something structural, something they could navigate from any point. Halden Development Group, founded 2009, ostensibly a boutique resort and residential developer. Publicly, 6 properties across Colorado and New Mexico. Profitable, unremarkable, the kind of high-end destination lodges that attracted certain types of wealthy clients and generated favorable local press about economic development and job creation. Privately, a different picture. 3 of Halden's most profitable properties had been acquired through what Elena had traced as a coordinated intimidation program. She called it that, a program, because the consistency across cases was too precise to be coincidental. Same law firms, same sequence of pressure tactics, same timeline. And in all 3 cases, the original landowners had either sold under duress or, in one case, simply disappeared from the public record in a way that suggested they'd been convinced to leave quietly and stay quiet. "There's more," she said. She tapped the USB drive. "I have a source inside Halden's legal team. I've had her for 4 months. She's been copying documents, internal memos, project planning files, correspondence between Halden's office and 3 different county officials." She looked at him carefully. "Including one memo that references your property by name and outlines in pretty explicit language. A plan to, and I'm quoting, resolve the cross-obstruction through direct engagement by Q4. The cabin was quiet except for the fire. "Direct engagement," Gavin said. "Yes, that's a memo. Dated October 3rd, 7 weeks ago." He picked up one of the printed documents and looked at it. Property acquisition agreement, legal boilerplate, 3 pages, the kind of thing that would take a forensic accountant to fully parse. But the names at the bottom were clear enough. Halden Development Group, and a county official's signature he recognized, the same county assessor who had filed the baseless zoning complaint against his cabin 14 months ago. "Your source inside the legal team," he said. "Does she know where you are right now?" Elena shook her head. "Nobody knows where I am right now." "Do you have any means of contact with the outside? Working phone, satellite communicator, anything?" "My phone lost signal at the bottom of the Ridge Road. I have a satellite messenger, but the battery's been failing in the cold. I tried to get a ping out when I was on the road, and I don't know if it went through." Gavin nodded slowly. He was thinking in the way he used to think before operations, laying the terrain over the problem. What they had, what they lacked, what the opposing force knew and didn't know. What the opposing force knew. Gavin Cross had been left in the snow and should be dead or close to it by morning. They did not know about Elena. They did not know about this cabin. He was almost certain of that, because if they'd known about this cabin, they'd have used it to stage their operation rather than leaving him in the exposed bowl. What they didn't know, that someone had followed them up the mountain and brought him out alive. That there was documented evidence on a USB drive in a waterproof envelope sitting on the floor of a cabin they'd never find unless they had 6 men in 3 days and significantly better luck than they deserved. "How much of what's on that drive is enough?" he asked. Elena considered it honestly. "Enough to reopen an FBI investigation, if it gets to the right hands. Enough to publish, if I can get it to an editor who isn't afraid of Halden." She paused. "Not enough for an arrest, not without corroboration from the source directly. She'd have to testify." "Would she?" "6 weeks ago I would have said yes. Right now I don't know. If Halden finds out what happened tonight..." She stopped. "He'll know by morning," Gavin said. "The men he sent up here will report back. The question is what story they tell him, whether they tell him I'm dead or whether they report a complication." She looked at him. "What kind of complication?" "The kind that has documentation and a witness and is currently sitting in a cabin that isn't on any map thinking about next steps." For the first time since she'd appeared in the clearing with her flashlight, Elena Voss almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Honestly? A stubborn guy in over his head who needed rescuing and would spend the rest of the night being difficult about having needed it." "I'm still being difficult," Gavin said. "I just have better reasons now." But they took watches. He insisted on it, not because he fully trusted her. Trust was something he built in increments, and he'd known this woman for 3 hours, but because it was tactically correct. 2 people, 2 sets of eyes, alternating rest. He took first watch and let her sleep, which she did within minutes, the sleep of someone who'd been running on adrenaline for hours and had finally hit the wall. He sat near the window and looked out at the dark tree line and let his mind work. The memo she'd shown him, direct engagement by Q4, meant they'd been planning this for at least 7 weeks. That meant the late-night trespass, the cut power line, the legal harassment, All of it had been Phase 1. This was Phase 2. And Phase 2 was the one where they stopped pretending they were operating within some boundary of plausible deniability. That was a risk they'd only take if the timeline on whatever Halden was planning had accelerated, if something was pressing. He thought about the maps he'd seen briefly in the documents Elena had spread on the floor. He hadn't had time to study them, but he'd cataloged what he could, a reflex from years of processing visual information quickly in conditions that didn't allow for study. He'd seen topographical lines he recognized, not just his property, a much larger section of the ridge. He'd seen his land, yes, but he'd also seen the creek valley to the north, the old mining access roads on the eastern face, and something on the northeast corner of the map, a marking he hadn't been able to read clearly, but that had the precise geometric quality of a construction site blueprint. Not a resort. Something else. He filed the thought and kept watching the tree line. The snow had stopped. The temperature had dropped further, which meant the night was going to get colder before it got warmer, and it wouldn't start getting warmer until past 400. Kodiak's breathing had evened out. The dog was asleep, but his ears moved independently of his body, tracking sounds even in sleep. The leg would need veterinary attention. Gavin could feel from the way the dog had been favoring it that the joint was more than bruised. But it was holding, and Kodiak had worked worse. He checked his watch at 01:30. His body temperature was back to normal. The stiffness in his shoulders from the zip ties was subsiding into a dull ache. His hands were functional. He was going to be sore for a week. He'd been sorrier. Elena woke herself at 02:30 without him having to touch her. Another thing he noticed, another point in the column marked, not what she appears on the surface. She sat up, immediately oriented, and looked at him. "Anything?" she said. No movement. They're either waiting for daylight, or they think the weather finished the job. She pulled herself to her feet, rolled her neck, and came to the window. She looked out at the same tree line he'd been watching for 3 hours. "I need to get those images off the camera card," she said. "If something happens to the camera, I lose everything." "Do you have cloud backup?" "Automatic, but it needs signal." She looked at him sideways. "You said there's no signal above the first ridge." "There's not." He paused. "There's a repeater. Old Forestry Service equipment on the northeast face. I don't know if it's still active, but it was 3 months ago. I got a bar when I was checking that section of the fence line." "How far?" "From here, about 2 miles, but it's on the northeast face." She understood immediately what that meant. The northeast face was the direction the construction site marking had been on the map. And 2 miles in current conditions, before daylight, across terrain she didn't know, with a man who'd been left in the snow to die 4 hours ago and a dog with an injured leg. "When does it get light?" she asked. "This time of year around 06:30. She looked at the window, looked at the document envelope on the floor, looked at her camera. "I want to see what's on those maps," she said, "the ones from my source. I want you to look at them with me." He moved away from the window and sat beside her on the floor. She opened the waterproof envelope and spread the documents between them, and this time Gavin took his time with each one, and what he found in the construction maps, 3 pages, detailed, with elevation notations and access road specifications, and a grid reference that corresponded to a section of the northeast face he'd always assumed was just rock and old growth, made the cold outside feel like a secondary concern. It wasn't a resort. The access roads were wrong for a resort. The foundation specifications were wrong. And the notation in the bottom right corner of the 3rd page referenced a permit number from the Colorado Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety. They weren't building a luxury development on Silverpine Ridge. They were mining it. And the 43 acres of Cross family land sat directly over the primary access route to the site. Gavin set the page down carefully. He looked at the window, at the cold dark beyond it, at the ridgeline barely visible against a sky that was only slightly lighter than it had been an hour ago. "How long have you had these?" he said. His voice was even. 3 weeks, Elena said. "I didn't understand them. I thought they were construction plans for the resort." "They're not." "I can see that now." She was looking at his face. "What is it? What are they mining?" He thought about the creek that ran through the northeast valley, the color it sometimes ran in spring, that faintly reddish tint he'd always attributed to iron-rich soil. The way the rock changed composition on the northeast face, the different texture and weight of the stones he'd found there. He thought about the Korengal Valley, actually, about the classified briefings he'd received about rare earth mineral deposits in remote terrain and why certain valleys were more strategically contested than they appeared on paper. "I'm not a geologist," he said. "But," he looked at her, "there's a reason they need my land specifically. It's not about the view." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Whatever they're after, it's worth more than a resort." "Significantly," Gavin said. Which means the memo that said resolve the cross obstruction by Q4 wasn't about a development timeline. "It was about a mining permit deadline," she said. He nodded. She pulled her knees to her chest and stared at the documents. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. Ranger, still at the door, suddenly lifted his head. Not the alert he used for wind or animals. The other one. The one that meant something with two legs was moving in the trees. Gavin was on his feet before the dog made a sound. Ranger didn't bark. That was the thing about a well-trained dog. The alert wasn't noise. It was posture. The head came up, the ears went forward and slightly apart. The body went still in a specific way that was different from sleep stillness or rest stillness. It was the stillness of something that had made a decision and was waiting for permission to act on it. Gavin read it in under a second and was moving in two. He crossed to the stove and closed the damper down to its narrowest setting, cutting the visible light from the seams in the iron door. The candle on the shelf he pinched out with 2 fingers. The cabin went dark except for the faint gray that came through the single south-facing window. Not enough to see by, but enough to tell him Elena had pressed herself against the wall beside the door without being told to, camera bag pulled tight against her body, breathing controlled. He got low. Below the window line. He came up on the edge of the frame and looked out through the glass at a 45-degree angle, the way you look through windows in rooms that might have someone looking back. 2 shapes, 50 meters out, maybe 55, moving through the pines on the downhill side of the cabin. Not fast. Deliberate. Using the trees for cover, which told him they'd been trained in basic movement discipline, which told him they weren't the same men who'd come up the east approach 8 months ago. Those had been hired muscle, local, clumsy, improvised. These moved differently. He held up 2 fingers toward Elena. She nodded once, tight. He watched the shapes. They were moving parallel to the cabin, not directly toward it, which meant either they hadn't spotted the structure yet, or they were performing a sweep pattern, checking the terrain in sections rather than going straight to a target. A sweep pattern meant they were searching, not converging. Searching was better. It meant they weren't certain. The shapes stopped. One of them raised something to their face, binoculars or a monocular, low light capability most likely, and pointed it uphill. Gavin dropped below the window frame and put his back against the wall. He heard Elena's breath from across the room. She was keeping it slow. 30 seconds. He counted them. Then he came back up to the edge of the frame. The shapes were moving again, continuing the parallel sweep, heading north along the tree line, away from the cabin. He stayed at the window until they were out of sight. Then he stayed another 4 minutes because the instinct to move immediately after a threat passes was how you walked into the second element you hadn't seen yet. When he finally moved away from the window, Elena was already at his shoulder. "How many?" she whispered. "2 visible. Assume more." "They're sweeping." "Yes. They know roughly where I ended up. The bowl was their chosen site. They know the terrain in that section. They're working outward from there." He looked at the door. The eastern sky through the cabin's single window had gone from black to the specific dark blue that preceded dawn by about 90 minutes. "They're going to find this cabin eventually. It's the only structure on the north face." "How long do we have?" "At that sweep rate, moving north, they'll double back south in maybe 40 minutes. They'll pass within 20 meters of this door on the return." Elena looked at the documents on the floor. The USB drive. "We have to move." "Yes." He was already thinking about it, the terrain overlaid in his mind the way it always was up here. Not a map, but a physical memory, the kind that lived in the legs and feet rather than in the head. "We go northeast. The repeater is 2 miles. We need signal to get those images off your card, and we need to reach someone who isn't inside Halden's reach before those men report back. Your satellite messenger. You said you didn't know if the ping went through. I didn't. But if it did, someone will be looking. The messenger logs a GPS coordinate when it transmits. She hesitated one beat. My editor in Denver. The one who killed the story. Not him. I know. I have a contact at the Denver Post, independent from my paper. I've been feeding her information on background for 6 months. She knows enough to act on it if I can reach her. A pause. And I have a direct number for the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Not the field office that killed it. The unit chief in Washington. How do you have that? I've been doing this for 14 months, she said. You collect numbers. He looked at her for a moment in the dark cabin. She was holding the waterproof envelope against her chest, the camera bag on her shoulder, and she was scared. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her eyes kept moving to the door. But she wasn't letting the fear make decisions for her. Boots on, he said. We leave in 3 minutes. They went out through the back of the cabin, a maintenance panel in the rear wall that his grandfather had installed as a second exit, which his grandfather had called practical, and which Gavin had always understood to be the thinking of a man who'd learned the hard way that one exit was a trap. The panel opened onto the slope behind the structure, north-facing, still in deep shadow. He went first, then the dogs. Kodiak moving on 3 legs with a grim, businesslike efficiency that made something tighten in Gavin's chest. Then Elena, pulling the panel shut behind her. He set the pace at the edge of what the terrain would allow, fast enough to create distance before the sweep team doubled back, slow enough to keep Kodiak functional and to keep Elena on her feet on the grade, which was steep in the first quarter mile and covered with a crust of refrozen snow that broke unpredictably underfoot, sometimes holding your weight and sometimes collapsing and dropping you 6 inches without warning. Elena fell once in the first 10 minutes. She caught herself on her hands, came up without a sound, kept moving. Gavin's shoulder started talking to him about 15 minutes in, the left one, the one that had been wrenched when they took him down in the clearing the night before. It wasn't a sharp pain, just a persistent, nagging ache that flared every time he used the arm to steady himself on a descent. He ignored it with the particular discipline of someone who'd spent years in environments where acknowledging pain was a luxury you scheduled for later. The northeast face opened up after the first ridge. The tree cover thinned and the terrain became rockier, the snow shallower over the stone substrate, which made the footing better but made them more visible. Dawn was coming fast. The sky ahead of them, beyond the ridgeline, had gone from deep blue to something lighter, and the outlines of things were starting to separate from the dark. How much further? Elena asked. She wasn't winded exactly, but her voice had the quality of someone managing their breathing consciously. Half mile. Maybe 600 meters. Ranger had been ranging out ahead and to the right, performing a function nobody had asked him to perform, but that he'd apparently decided was necessary. Every few minutes he'd stop, look back at Gavin, and move on, clearing the ground ahead the way he'd been trained to clear it. Kodiak stayed at Gavin's heel without being commanded to. The dog knew what he could manage. They found the underground structure by accident. Gavin had seen the northeast face dozens of times, walked it, worked it, checked fence posts along its upper boundary in spring when the snow melt made the ground soft enough to reveal whether the posts had heaved over winter. He knew where the rock faces were, where the old mining test shafts from the 1890s had been sunk and capped, where the ground was solid and where it was undermined by the creek drainage that ran below the surface before it emerged about 300 meters downhill. He did not know about the structure built into the base of the secondary rock face beneath a natural overhang concealed by a combination of the overhang itself, the surrounding old growth, and what appeared to be a covering of artificial materials, netting, and what in summer would have been brush and in winter was brush covered with snow, constructed to blend with the surrounding terrain from above. Ranger found it because Ranger found the ventilation outlet, a pipe, 4 inches in diameter, emerging from the rock face at ground level and capped with a mesh cover. The dog stopped at it, nose working, and looked back. Gavin stopped. He looked at the pipe. He looked at the overhang above it. He looked at the rock face and saw what he'd missed on every previous walk of this terrain, A seam in the stone that wasn't a natural seam. A door, cut and fitted to blend. "What is that?" Elena said behind him. "I don't know yet." He wasn't going to open the door. That was the correct decision, tactically. An unknown enclosed space, possible occupants, no weapon, one exit. You didn't open that door. He opened the door. The reason was the markings. Stenciled on the rock face to the right of the seam, barely visible under years of weather and deliberate weathering in, was a set of alphanumeric codes that he recognized in the way you recognized something you'd seen in briefing documents at a classification level that meant you signed papers about what you would and wouldn't discuss for the rest of your life. Not mining codes. Not construction codes. He opened the door. Inside, cool air, the smell of concrete and electrical systems, a space roughly 6 meters by 8 carved into the base of the rock with poured concrete walls, lit by 2 battery-powered emergency strips that had come on automatically when the door triggered a sensor. Metal shelving along both walls. Crates, equipment cases. A folding table in the center with maps pinned to a board above it. A shortwave radio on the shelf to the right, military spec, older model, but maintained. And in the center of the table, beneath the maps, a stack of documents in a plastic sleeve, the kind with federal agency watermarks visible through the cover sheet. Elena made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She moved past him to the table, pulled her flashlight, and started reading the cover sheet. Gavin went to the radio. Checked the power source. A battery bank, 3/4 charge. Checked the frequency settings. It was set to a band he recognized, not the county emergency frequency, something older and less regulated. He picked up the handset, keyed it, listened. Static. He switched the receive-only mode on and let it run. "Gavin." Elena's voice had changed. It had gone flat and careful in the way voices went when the brain was processing something it wasn't sure it believed yet. He went to the table. The document in her hands was 7 pages. The cover sheet bore the logo of a federal resource management agency. The title was administrative language, dense, deliberately boring, but the substance, when Elena read it aloud in a low voice, was anything but. A 2019 survey, commissioned by an entity that was listed as a subsidiary of Halden Development Group, but which Gavin immediately recognized as a shell structure. A name that didn't correspond to any public-facing company, attached to a tax ID number that would dissolve the moment someone looked too hard at it. The survey covered the northeast quadrant of Silverpine Ridge and the subsurface geology of the Creek Valley. The findings: significant concentrations of rare earth elements, neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, across a deposit estimated at commercial extraction scale, recoverable with current technology, economically viable at current market pricing, and significantly more viable at the projected pricing curve for the next decade, given demand from battery manufacturing and defense electronics. The estimated value of the deposit, at conservative recovery rates, was listed in a figure that Elena read twice. Gavin looked at the number. He looked at the wall. He thought about the memo, resolved the cross-obstruction by Q4, and understood now the exact weight of the word obstruction. He wasn't a stubborn man holding on to family land for sentimental reasons. He was the owner of 43 acres of surface rights that sat on top of a rare earth deposit worth more than most countries' annual GDP. He was the only thing standing between Victor Halden and that number. "We need to photograph everything in this room," he said. Elena was already raising the camera. They spent 11 minutes inside. Elena shot every document, every map, every label on every crate. Gavin checked the crates. 2 of them held equipment he recognized from demolition operations, the kind used for controlled rock face removal, legally classified as mining explosive material, but requiring specific federal licensing. 3 others held equipment he recognized from a different context entirely. Signal interception hardware, the kind that could monitor radio traffic across a county without a warrant and without anyone knowing it was there. That last part reconfigured something in his understanding of the past 18 months. The way the county sheriff had seemed to know, always, just enough to stay unhelpful. The way Patricia Deer's calls from her office had always been slightly more guarded than her calls from her cell. The way his own shortwave radio had twice picked up interference that he'd attributed to weather. They'd been listening. For months. possibly longer. To every call he'd made from the cabin, every conversation within range of his radio, every piece of communication that passed through the county's infrastructure. He unplugged the signal interception units from their power source. Both of them. "Ready?" Elena said. "Yes." They came out of the structure into a morning that had gone from dark blue to gray-white, the sun still below the ridge but its approach visible in the quality of the light. Gavin shut the door behind them and looked uphill, looked downhill, listened. Nothing immediate, but the sweep team had had enough time to double back. They were somewhere on this mountain, and this mountain was getting smaller as the light improved. The repeater was 200 meters north, positioned on a natural promontory of rock that he'd always used as a navigation landmark. He moved to it at a pace that was close to a jog, and had no patience for the shoulder or the cold or anything else. The Forestry Service repeater was a battered unit mounted on a galvanized pole, solar-charged. The solar panel cracked along one edge, but functional. The signal indicator light was green. He grabbed Elena's arm and pointed at her phone. She already had it out. 1 bar, then 2. She moved 2 steps left and got 3. "Send everything," he said. Her thumbs were moving before he finished the sentence. She had an automated cloud sync that queued every image from the card. She opened a messaging app, typed a name, her contact at the Denver Post, he assumed, and sent a message he couldn't read and didn't ask to. Then she pulled up a number from memory, not from her contacts, and made a call. It connected on the second ring. Gavin could hear the other end faintly. "This is Elena Voss. I need to speak with—" A pause. "Tell him it's the Halden file. Tell him I have documentary evidence of federal permit fraud, rare earth extraction without authorization, and coordinated criminal intimidation. Tell him I have photographs of an unlicensed signal interception operation on federal adjacent land." Another pause, shorter. "Yes, I'll hold." She looked at Gavin. Her eyes were very focused. Her hands, he noticed, had a slight tremor that she wasn't able to entirely suppress. He wasn't judging it. His shoulder was on fire, and he was fairly certain he'd torn something in his left hamstring on the descent from the rock face, because his leg had started communicating complaints that were getting harder to schedule for later. The hold lasted 40 seconds. "Yes," Elena said. "Yes, that's correct. I'm transmitting images to a secure cloud address right now. I'll give you the access credentials." She stepped away, turned slightly, keeping her voice low. Gavin turned his back to give her the space and looked out from the promontory across the northeast valley below. In the improving morning light, he could see the geometry of what had been cleared down there. Not the natural clearing patterns of snow and rock, but the deliberate, 2 regular shapes of a site that had been prepared. Access roads, packed earth, drainage channels cut into the slope, all of it invisible from the service road or from the south face of the ridge. Visible only from here, from this exact vantage point, which happened to be on his land. He wondered if the man in the balaclava had known that. He suspected the man in the balaclava had known exactly that. Ranger appeared at his left, pressed against his leg, looking out at the same valley with the same kind of attention. Kodiak sat down heavily on Gavin's right and leaned. The dog was tired. Gavin put his hand on Kodiak's head without looking down. Elena ended the call. She stood still for a moment, processing. "He's contacting the Denver field director directly," she said. "Not the same office, a different chain of command." She turned. "The images are going to 3 separate secure locations. My source's documents are already attached." She looked at her phone, then at him. "The cloud sync finished. Everything from the room is uploaded." "Good." He said, "The unit chief said it could be 48 hours before they can move." 48 hours, Gavin said. "Yes." He looked at the valley, at the prepared site, at the ridge line and the tree line, and all the places that a sweep team with good equipment and enough men could use to make 48 hours feel much longer than it was. "We need to move again," he said. "Where?" Before he could answer, Ranger's head came up, both ears. The dog turned northeast and made a sound Gavin had heard exactly once before, on a training exercise in the Mojave when the OPEF element had flanked them from a direction the team hadn't adequately monitored. Not the search alert, the contact alert. 3 seconds later, the first shot came through the trees. It hit the rock face of the promontory 2 feet to Gavin's left, and the sound of it, The snap and the delayed report and the shower of stone fragments arrived almost simultaneously, and then there was no thinking, only movement. Down, move, northeast, use the rocks, do not stop. Elena was already moving. She didn't ask questions. She didn't freeze. She dropped below the rock line and went. The camera bag clutched against her side, and Gavin went right behind her, and the second shot hit higher on the rock face, overcorrected, which told him the shooter was adjusting and hadn't expected them to drop so fast, which told him the shooter was good but not exceptional, which told him he had a margin. He used it. The northeast face dropped sharply past the promontory, a natural descent that cut left behind a series of boulder formations and then leveled into the upper creek drainage. He knew every meter of it. He'd checked fence posts along it in spring, walked it in summer, crossed it on snowshoes in February 2 years ago looking for an injured elk that turned out to have already died up near the secondary ridge. He ran it now from memory in the improving light with his shoulder screaming and his left leg complaining and 2 dogs and a journalist with shaking hands and half the world's evidence against Victor Halden on a camera card that could not, under any circumstances, end up in the snow. Another shot, further. The shooter had lost the angle. Gavin kept running. The creek drainage leveled out 50 meters below the promontory, and the boulder field provided cover on 3 sides. He pulled up behind the largest formation, granite, shoulder height, oriented east-west, natural defilade, and Elena came in behind him and put her back against the stone. They were both breathing hard. "How many shooters?" she said. "1 rifle, possibly a second element on foot that hasn't committed yet." He looked at the terrain above them. The shooter's last position had been northeast, above the promontory, which meant they'd been on the ridgeline before the shot, which meant they'd moved into position while Gavin and Elena were inside the structure. They found the room. She processed that. "They know we were in there." "Yes." "Which means they know we have—" "Yes." A silence between them that was doing a lot of work. "The images are already uploaded," she said. It sounded like she was reminding herself. "That's the only thing that matters right now." She was reminding herself. "That's the only thing that matters right now." He looked at the drainage. It ran downhill to the west, eventually joining the main creek that ran along the southern boundary of his property before it crossed onto the national forest land. If they followed it, they'd end up in the lower valley. Public land, multiple trail access points, 2 miles from the service road. The kind of terrain where a shooter on a ridge lost the dominant advantage. He looked at Kodiak. The dog was standing, alert, favoring the leg, but fully functional, ready. "Can you run?" he asked Elena. She looked at him like the question was slightly insulting. "Yes," she said. "Then don't stop until I tell you. Stay low in the drainage, use the creek bed for sound cover, and if I go down, you take the dogs and you keep moving. You don't stop for me, you understand?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely classify. "I already came back for you once tonight," she said. "Don't tell me what to do." He almost said something, decided against it. He went out from behind the rock first, moving low and fast along the drainage, and behind him came the sound of Elena Voss following him down the mountain, and behind her, barely audible over the wind and the rushing of the snowmelt creek below, the sound of men on the ridgeline calling to each other, adjusting, beginning to follow. The mountain was not done with them yet, but it wasn't done with the mountain either. The creek drainage ran west and slightly south, and Gavin used it the way he used everything up here, as a tool, not a path. The creek itself was frozen at the edges and running dark in the center, and the sound of the water covered their movement the way white noise covers a conversation, imperfectly but enough. He kept them in the lowest part of the drainage below the sight lines from the ridge, moving fast through the places where the boulder field provided overhead concealment and slower through the exposed sections where the drainage widened and the cover thinned. Behind them, uphill, the voices had stopped. That was worse than if they'd continued. Voices meant men still organizing. Silence meant men already moving. He counted the terrain in his head. 200 meters to the first bend where the drainage curved south around the base of an old rock fall. Past that, the gradient decreased, and the creek widened into a flat section where in spring the elk came to drink, and in winter the snow accumulated in drifts that could run chest high. Past that, another 400 meters to where the creek crossed the property boundary onto national forest land. Kodiak was running on 3 legs and refusing to acknowledge it. Ranger had moved out 30 meters ahead, threading through the boulders without sound, appearing and disappearing. Elena ran like someone who'd run in bad conditions before. Not graceful, not fast, but consistent, with the slightly forward-leaning posture of someone who'd learned that efficiency mattered more than form over distance. She'd stopped checking behind her. Checking behind you while running in rough terrain was how you went down. The first bend came up in what felt like 4 minutes. Gavin pulled up on the protected side of the rock fall, back against the stone, and held up a fist. Elena stopped beside him, both of them breathing. He listened. Movement, uphill. 2 sources, he thought, but the acoustic properties of the drainage made it difficult to be precise. They were moving on the ridge line above, not down into the drainage, which meant they were tracking by sight from elevation rather than following on foot, which meant they had eyes on the terrain but had lost direct visual on him and Elena when the boulder field closed in overhead. "They're above us," he said quietly. "Not behind. How far to the property line?" 400 meters past the flat section. And past the property line? National forest, trail access, possible road contact within 2 miles. She processed this. They won't follow onto national forest land? Depends on how much Halden is paying and how much legal exposure they're willing to take on. He looked at the sky above the ridge. The sun was fully up now, still below the ridgeline from their position, but lighting the high country above them with a flat, hard winter light that would make them visible from the ridge the moment they crossed the flat section. "The flat is our problem." She looked where he was looking. Through the gap in the boulder field, she could see the wide section. 40 meters of open ground, creek running down the center, no cover except the snow itself, which was no cover at all. "How fast can you cross it?" she said. 40 seconds? Maybe 35 if I'm not—" He stopped. His left leg had been tightening since the run from the promontory, and the hamstring complaint from earlier had upgraded itself to something more serious. He was limping slightly and had been for the last 100 meters, managing it well enough that Elena hadn't commented on it. She'd noticed. He could tell by the way she didn't comment on it. 35 seconds, he said. "They're on a ridge with a rifle." "Yes." "So we need to time it for when they're not looking directly at the crossing point." He looked at her. "I was covering conflict in Honduras for 8 months in 2019, she said. "I know what a sniper problem looks like." He recalibrated her again for the 3rd or 4th time since the clearing. "Then you know you wait for them to move." "How do you know when they move?" "Ranger." The dog was at the edge of the flat section, 40 meters ahead, sitting. Not the contact alert, not the search alert. Sitting and watching the ridgeline above with the specific focused attention of an animal that had been trained to track moving human targets in terrain exercises. When Ranger moved, it meant the targets had moved. They waited 4 minutes. The cold worked on them without mercy. Elena put her hands in her jacket pockets, and Gavin put his against his thighs, and they both looked at the dog. Ranger stood, looked back, looked north along the ridge, moved 2 steps forward. "Now," Gavin said. They went. He pushed through the pain in his leg and moved as fast as the terrain allowed, and Elena kept pace on his left and the dogs crossed with them. Kodiak making it across in long, bounding strides that compensated for the damaged leg with a mechanical determination that had nothing sentimental in it. 30 meters, 20. The ridge above them was empty sky. The shooters moved north, the angle gone. 15 meters. 10. The shot when it came was from the south, not the ridge, not the position he'd been tracking. A second element. He'd assumed it and then let the assumption slide while managing the primary threat, which was the kind of error that happened when you were running on no sleep and a torn hamstring and the accumulated weight of a night that had started with your face in the snow. The round hit the ice at the creek's edge, 3 feet to his right, and the sound of it was a sharp, flat crack that echoed off the rock walls of the drainage in a way that made it impossible to immediately locate the source. He went left instinctively toward the north bank, and the bank here was undercut, an overhang of frozen earth and root system that provided 18 inches of genuine ballistic cover. He went under it and pulled Elena down beside him, and they were both against the frozen bank with the creek inches from their feet and the dogs pressed in around them. "South," he said. "Elevated, maybe 200 meters." She had her phone out, looking at it. "Still 1 bar," she said. "Call someone." "I'm calling 911. "Don't. Call your Denver Post contact. Tell her we're taking fire on Silverpine Ridge northeast face. Tell her we need law enforcement at the National Forest Trailhead on Forest Road 14. Tell her that last part specifically." She was already dialing. "Why that specifically?" "Because the Harlan County Sheriff is not who I want arriving on this mountain right now." The call connected. She talked for 40 seconds, relayed exactly what he'd said, and ended it. Another shot from the south, higher, probing, not aimed. The shooter had lost visual on their exact position when they went under the bank. Gavin looked along the undercut bank. It ran another 20 meters north before it petered out into open ground. 20 meters of cover, and then the property line was less than 100 meters beyond that. "We move along the bank," he said. "Keep contact with the earth above you. Don't straighten up until I tell you." "What about the shooter?" "He's elevated and static, and he's lost us. Moving targets under cover are a different problem than crossing open ground." He looked at Ranger. The dog was watching the south, ears working. "When Ranger runs, you run." Ranger ran. They ran. The bank held for 18 meters before it dropped to nothing, and the last 2 meters were open, and Gavin went through them bent at the waist and felt the round hit snow somewhere behind him, and then they were into the tree line on the north side of the drainage, and the geometry changed completely. The trees were old growth, Douglas fir mostly, and the canopy overhead was dense enough that the light changed when you entered, dimmer, broken into long shafts, the snow shallower beneath the branches. No sight lines from elevation. You could stand 12 feet from someone in this forest and not see them unless they moved. He stopped inside the first serious tree cover and bent forward with his hands on his knees and let his leg do what it needed to for 10 seconds. The hamstring had torn properly at some point in the last 100 meters. He knew the feel of it. He'd done the same thing on a training run in Virginia 7 years ago and had spent 3 weeks in physical therapy and been furious about every day of it. Elena put her hand on his arm, not asking anything, just acknowledging. He straightened up. "Property line is 50 meters, he said. "We cross it, and we're on federal land, and whoever those men are, they have to make a decision about how far Halden's money goes." They crossed the property line. He knew it by the old survey stake his grandfather had driven into the base of a fir tree in 1961. Orange paint long since faded to a ghost of color, the metal rusted but still there. Nothing followed them across it. He stood on the other side of that line and listened for 2 full minutes. Wind, creek sound, bird call, far up the ridge, a clarion jay, which meant nothing was actively disturbing the terrain in that direction. The shooters had stopped. He exhaled slowly. It took them an hour and 40 minutes to reach Forest Road 14, moving through the national forest at a pace dictated by Kodiak's leg and Gavin's own, which was stiffening badly now that the adrenaline was metabolizing. The dog and the man were limping in rough synchrony by the time the road appeared through the trees. 2 tire-width tracks of packed snow running east-west through the forest, the kind of road that existed on maps only if you knew to look. A vehicle was parked at the trailhead marker, a green pickup truck, county plates, and leaning against it with his arms folded was a man Gavin didn't recognize. Mid-40s, canvas jacket, a look on his face that was trying to be professionally neutral and not quite managing it. But behind the green pickup were 2 vehicles that made the green pickup irrelevant. A black Ford Expedition, and behind it, a Colorado State Patrol unit. And standing beside the Expedition, on the phone, was a woman Gavin didn't know, but Elena apparently did, because Elena made a sound beside him that was mostly relief and crossed the remaining distance to the road at something close to a run. "Rachel," Elena said. The woman on the phone held up one finger, finished the call, and looked at Elena with the particular expression of someone who had spent the last 3 hours managing a situation that kept expanding. "You look terrible," Rachel said. "I know." The images came through. All of them. She looked at Gavin, a frank, appraising look. "You're Cross." "Yes." Rachel Morrow, Denver Post. She extended her hand and he shook it. Her grip was firm, and she didn't let go immediately, which meant she was reading something she wanted to read. "I've got a state patrol captain on the line with the FBI field director in Denver. Not the office Elena dealt with before. A separate chain. She finally let go of his hand. I also have a statement from a source inside Halden Development Group's legal division that was transmitted to me 40 minutes ago. The source decided to move, Elena said. She did. Rachel paused. She also sent something you didn't have. Internal accounting documents showing Halden's subsidiary payments to 2 county officials, and she looked at Gavin directly. A county law enforcement official. One payment 2 years ago, $12,000, to an account registered to a Leonard Braddock. The name landed like something physical. He stood with that for a moment. Braddock. The phone call, 18 months ago. Did anyone actually damage your property? Did anyone threaten you directly? The careful, practiced unhelpfulness of a man who'd been paid to be exactly that. He took $12,000, Gavin said. To not look too hard, Rachel said. Yes. He nodded slowly. He wasn't surprised. Not really. That was the thing. He wasn't surprised, and that fact about himself was its own particular kind of information. The man from the county vehicle had approached. Mr. Cross? He had the posture of a law enforcement officer and the discomfort of a law enforcement officer who understood he was significantly outranked by the situation he'd walked into. Deputy Marcus Webb, Harlan County, I got a call from State Patrol. Who do you answer to? Gavin said. Directly. Sheriff Brad? Not him. Gavin looked at the State Patrol unit. Who's in that vehicle? Captain Diaz, State Patrol, Criminal Investigations Division. Rachel answered before Webb could. She's been in contact with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit since 4 this morning. When your satellite messenger ping was logged, the GPS coordinate your messenger transmitted was this trailhead. He processed that. The satellite messenger sent from the service road. It had gone through after all. It had been sitting in a queue somewhere for 6 hours before someone acted on it. Captain Diaz, Gavin said. I need to speak with her. Captain Rosa Diaz was 51 years old and had the kind of face that had stopped performing patience sometime in her early 40s and replaced it with something more efficient. She finished her phone call, got out of the expedition, and stood in the road with her hands at her sides and looked at Gavin Cross, the way she looked at everything, like she was measuring it for what it was rather than what it appeared to be. You've had a significant night, she said. I have. I've got 2 of my people heading up the service road right now to your property. I also have a call out to the San Juan County SWAT unit about the individuals who were shooting at you, which is a crime regardless of what else is happening. She paused. I need you to tell me everything. Start with when they took you and end with right now. Don't editorialize. Don't skip anything you think is too small. He told her. It took 18 minutes, standing on a snow-packed forest road in the December morning, his leg getting progressively worse, and his shoulder joining in with its own commentary. He was concise, and he was accurate, and he didn't editorialize. He told her about the camera being rotated, the zip ties, the bowl in the ridge, the man in the balaclava and what he said, the temperature and the timeline. He told her about Elena finding him in the hunting cabin and the documents. He told her about the structure on the northeast face, what was inside it, the signal interception hardware, the mining survey. He told her about the shooting, both shooters, the angles and the estimated distances. Diaz listened without interrupting. She had a small notebook, but she didn't write in it. She was the kind of person who processed information in real time and wrote the notes later when the picture was complete. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. The structure on the northeast face, she said. You're certain about the signal interception hardware? Yes. Manufacturer? Model? He told her. She wrote that down. The Rare Earth Survey document. Federal agency watermark. Which agency? He told her that too. She wrote it. The memo that referenced your property. Quote it as exactly as you can. Resolve the cross obstruction through direct engagement by Q4. She wrote it and looked at it. The man in the balaclava, she said. Height, build, voice characteristics. 6 feet, give or take an inch, lean, moved efficiently. Voice was mid-Atlantic, no strong regional accent, low mid-register, controlled. He was used to giving direction. Not a contractor. No. Someone higher up. Diaz looked at her notebook. She looked at the expedition. She looked at Gavin. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to understand that I'm telling you as a courtesy because you could have died last night and because what you've handed us is significant." She paused. Halden Development Group has been under a parallel investigation by the Department of Interior for 11 months, separate from the FBI public corruption inquiry, related to suspected fraudulent permit applications for mineral extraction rights on or adjacent to federally protected land. The morning was cold and still, and that sentence sat in it. 11 months, Gavin said. Yes. I've been fighting this for 18. Diaz met his eyes and didn't look away. I know, and I don't have a good answer for the gap. I'm sorry for it. He nodded. Not because he was satisfied, because there was nothing useful to do with the anger right now, and he knew it. What happens now? Elena said. She'd come up beside Gavin at some point in the last few minutes. Her camera was out, lens cap off. She wasn't shooting yet. She was waiting, reading the situation. We go up that mountain, Diaz said. My people, State Patrol, and within the hour I expect federal agents from 2 separate divisions. We secure the northeast face structure. We locate and detain the individuals who discharged weapons. She looked at both of them. You 2 are going to a hospital. That's not optional. I need... Elena started. You can have your phone. You can make calls from the vehicle. Your cloud upload is already done. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit confirmed receipt of the image packet 40 minutes ago, and your source's documents are being reviewed by a federal prosecutor as of 20 minutes ago. Diaz was looking at her the way you looked at someone you respected and were also done negotiating with. You don't need to be on the mountain for what happens next. It's already done. Elena looked at her phone. She looked at Gavin. He said nothing. He was watching Kodiak, who had finally sat down and was licking the injured leg with the steady, methodical attention of an animal that had been managing a problem for hours and was only now permitting itself to address it. The hospital has a vet on call, Webb said from somewhere behind them. He sounded slightly surprised by his own helpfulness. Gavin looked at the dog. He looked at the ridge, where his land sat under a December sky that was clear and hard and very blue. He looked at the road ahead. All right, he said. Dean, the emergency room in Harlan was a 6-bed facility attached to the county's only clinic, and it had the particular atmosphere of a place that was accustomed to doing more than its size suggested. The nurse who triaged Gavin, a man in his 40s named Curtis, who had the economical movements of someone who'd seen everything and was still deciding how to feel about most of it, looked at the bruising on his wrists, the shoulder, and the leg, and said almost nothing except to direct him to a bed and return 4 minutes later with an IV kit. Grade 2 hamstring tear, the physician told him 40 minutes later, in the tone of someone reporting a weather forecast. Possible partial tear of the posterior rotator cuff on the left. You're going to be a problem for a physical therapist for about 6 weeks. I've been a problem for physical therapists before. I imagine. The physician looked at the frostbite marking on his fingers. Superficial, 1st degree, he'd gotten the circulation back in time, and wrote something on a tablet. The restraint marks on your wrists were photographed and logged, per State Patrol request. Same with the bruising on your lower back. He looked up. Someone hit you with something. Know what? Something blunt. Didn't see it. Probably a baton or a heavy flashlight. No fractures, which is fortunate. He said fortunate the way people said words they'd decided to use instead of other more loaded words. We're keeping you for observation for 4 hours. After that, crutches for 2 weeks minimum, ice on the shoulder, and you need to see an orthopedist. He left. Gavin lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling and felt the accumulated weight of the last 18 months settle onto him all at once, the way weight did when you finally stop moving and there was nothing left to do except absorb it. His phone, retrieved from the cabin where he'd left it the previous afternoon, delivered to him by one of Diaz's officers who'd done a sweep of his property, had 43 missed calls. Most were from numbers he didn't recognize. 2 were from Patricia Deere. 1, from a Washington, D.C. area code, was from a number that the officer had circled on a sticky note and written beside it, DOI. Office of Inspector General. They called twice. He called Patricia first. She picked up on the first ring, which told him she'd been sitting with the phone. Gavin, I'm in the Harlan Clinic. I'm fine. A pause in which she was apparently deciding several things. I've had 4 calls this morning from federal agencies and 2 from journalists, she said. Do you want to tell me what happened, or should I just piece it together from the news? It's going to be on the news? Elena Voss's story is already on the Denver Post's website. It went up 40 minutes ago. Gavin. She stopped. It's comprehensive. It names Halden by name, it references the survey documents and the permit fraud, and it mentions a source inside Halden's legal team who is cooperating with federal investigators. Another pause. It also mentions that an unnamed landowner was left to die in the snow. Unnamed? For now, she's protecting you until she can confirm you consented to being named. A beat. Do you? He thought about it for exactly as long as it took to think about it clearly. Yes, he said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but less armored. Victor Halden's legal team issued a statement 20 minutes ago, denying all allegations, calling it defamatory. She paused. His CFO resigned this morning, before the statement went out. The CFO knew which way the wind was blowing before the statement was issued. That meant the statement was theater. The people closest to Halden were already calculating the distance between themselves and the wreckage. Patricia, he said, thank you for the property advice and the listening and for being honest when it would have been easier to be reassuring. She was quiet long enough that he thought the call had dropped. You're welcome, she said. I'll be at the clinic in an hour. Don't talk to any federal agents without me. I already talked to one. Of course you did. He could hear her picking up her car keys. Don't talk to any more. Well, Elena appeared in the doorway of his room at some point in the late morning. Her arm was in a soft splint. She'd been favoring her left wrist since the run down the drainage, and it had turned out to be a small fracture, the kind that came from catching yourself on a route in the dark, in bad conditions. She had her phone in her right hand and the expression of someone who had filed a story and was experiencing the particular strange emptiness that followed. She looked at him. He looked at her. It's out, she said. I heard. She came into the room and sat in the chair beside the bed without being invited or waiting for an invitation. She looked at her phone for a moment and then set it face down on her knee. Halden's CFO resigned, she said. Patricia told me. There's more. She picked the phone back up. The Department of Interior suspended the mineral extraction permit application that was filed under Halden's subsidiary 3 hours ago. The application had been pending for 14 months. Someone inside the agency had been holding it in a review queue, preventing it from being officially denied so Halden could continue to claim in investor documents that the permit was pending approval. Someone inside the agency on Halden's payroll. The FBI is looking at that person right now. She put the phone down again. And the man in the balaclava. He looked at her. Diaz's people found him, she said, on the northeast face, 200 meters from the structure, trying to access a vehicle that had been cached under the tree cover on an access road that isn't on any public map. She paused. His name is Conrad Vale. He's a former federal contractor, security and logistics, the kind of company that does work that other companies prefer to have done by someone officially at arm's length. Conrad Vale. The calm voice in the dark. The temperature is going to do the work. Is he talking? Gavin said. He asked for a lawyer immediately and has said nothing since. Elena's expression was neutral. But they found a phone on him with a text thread, and the name at the top of the thread is one of Halden's senior vice presidents. Gavin looked at the ceiling again. He thought about the bowl in the ridge, the snow in his face, the sound of the dogs moving toward him through the dark. He thought about how close the margins had been on every decision between that moment and this one. The dogs, he said. Kodiak's in surgery, Elena said. Her voice changed when she said it, a quality entering it that had nothing professional in it. The vet said it's a ligament repair, routine for the injury. He said the dog should have full function after recovery. The room was quiet. Ranger's fine, she said. He's with the vet tech. Apparently he refused to go in a crate, and they stopped trying. That sounds right, Gavin said. She almost smiled. Almost. The story named you, she said. I wasn't able to reach you for consent before it went up. I protected you as long as I could, but the federal case is going to name you anyway, and I thought, it's fine, Elena. You're sure? I'm sure. She looked at her hands, the soft splint on the left. She turned them over once, looking at the palms, and then set them in her lap. You could have died last night, she said. It wasn't accusatory, it was just a fact she was apparently still processing. Yes, he said. So could you. I know. She looked up. Was it worth it? He thought about the property line survey stake. The orange paint faded to almost nothing. The creek that ran red-tinted in spring over rare earth deposits worth more than anyone had told him his land was worth. The 43 acres his grandfather had built a life on without knowing what was underneath it. The fact that none of that was why he'd refused to sell in the first place. It was always worth it, he said. The other thing, the survey, the deposits, that doesn't change the reason. She looked at him for a long moment. What was the reason? She said. He looked at the window. Snow on the sill. The mountain, somewhere behind the gray sky. It was mine, he said, and I wasn't ready to let someone take it. Elena Voss picked up her phone. She looked at it. She set it face down on her knee again. Outside the clinic window, Harlan went about its day in the thin winter light, mostly unaware that by the following morning its name would appear in federal court documents and national news coverage, and that the quiet, stubborn man on the ridge that the town had mostly ignored for 4 years had become, without intending to, the fixed point around which a very large thing had finally broken. Harlan didn't know what had happened yet. That was the strange thing about the days that followed. The lag between an event and the world's understanding of it. That gap where the people closest to the thing were still processing while everyone else was just beginning to hear the first version of the story, which was never the accurate one. The accurate one took time. Victor Halden was arrested on a Thursday morning, 16 days after the night on the ridge. Gavin heard about it from Patricia Deere, who called him at 7:14 a.m. while he was on the porch of the cabin with coffee and crutches and Ranger at his feet and Kodiak inside, 3 weeks post-surgery and technically restricted from stairs, a restriction the dog was treating as a suggestion rather than a directive. It happened an hour ago, Patricia said. Federal marshals at his office in Denver. They're also executing warrants at the Halden Group's 3 subsidiary offices simultaneously. Asset freeze goes into effect at market open. He held the phone and looked at the ridge line. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of December cold that had a specific quality to it, not the brutal wet cold of the storm that had nearly killed him, but a dry, still cold that made everything look clean and hard-edged and very far away. How many charges? He said. The indictment is sealed for now, but my contact at the federal courthouse said the document is 26 pages. She paused. Conrad Vale negotiated a cooperation agreement 3 days ago. Whatever he gave them opened the whole structure. Vale had talked. The man who'd crouched in front of him in the dark and told him the temperature would do the work had, when faced with federal charges that carried sentences measured in decades, made the calculation that most people made. Braddock? Gavin said. Resigned yesterday. His attorney has been in contact with the DA's office. Another pause. Gavin, the 2 county assessors are also named in the indictment. The permit applications, the zoning complaints against you. All of it is documented as coordinated fraud. He said nothing. Are you all right? She said. Yes. That didn't sound like yes. He looked at his coffee. It had gone cold while he was on the phone. It sounds exactly like what I expected. I just didn't know if I'd be alive to see it. Patricia was quiet for a moment. She'd never been the type to fill silence with noise. The DOI's Office of Inspector General wants to speak with you next week, she said. About the northeast face structure and the signal interception equipment. I'll be with you. I know. Get some rest. He hung up. Ranger looked up at him from the porch boards, the way dogs looked at you when they'd understood the tone of a phone call, if not the content. Halden's in custody, Gavin told the dog. Ranger put his head back down. This information did not appear to significantly alter his outlook. The town took its time deciding what it thought. That was the accurate description. Not a single moment of revelation, not a town meeting where sentiment shifted, but a slow, grinding recalibration that happened in the way most social things happened in small places. In diners, at the gas station, in brief conversations between people who'd known each other for decades and now had to reconcile what they'd said about Gavin Cross over the past 4 years with what was currently on page 1 of the Denver Post. He drove into Harlan for the first time on crutches 12 days after the clinic to pick up a veterinary supply order for Kodiak's recovery. The hardware store owner, a man named Dale Pittner, who'd been in Harlan his whole life and had once told someone at a town hall that the Cross property was being wasted by a guy who didn't want to be part of the community, held the door open for him without being asked and didn't say anything, which was not nothing. In Harlan, holding a door for someone and not commenting on it was a specific kind of acknowledgement. The woman at the pharmacy counter, Gavin didn't know her name, had seen her twice in 4 years, said, while handing him his own prescription, "I'm glad you made it." Direct, brief, and then she looked at the next customer. No elaboration requested or provided. Patricia's receptionist, a 22-year-old named Jess, who'd once told Elena Voss when Elena had called looking for Gavin's number that she didn't give out information about clients, and had then apparently immediately texted a friend that Elena Voss had called, making the information broadly available within 3 hours. Jess looked at him when he came into Patricia's office and said, "The Denver Post ran a follow-up today. You're in the headline." I know," he said. "Is it weird?" He considered the question with the seriousness it probably didn't require. "Yes." "Huh," she said, and went back to her screen. That was Harlan. It wasn't a parade, it wasn't a formal apology from the people who'd believed the rumors about his mental state, who'd quietly accepted the version of him that Halden's network had manufactured. Unstable, difficult, a man whose stubbornness was indistinguishable from pathology. It was doors held open and sentences that ended before they said what they actually meant, and a pharmacist who looked him in the eye and said 4 words like they cost her something. He'd take it. Batien. Elena's story ran in 3 parts. The first had gone up the morning they came off the mountain. The second, a week later, went deeper into the structure of Halden's operation. The shell companies, the federal permit fraud, the coordinated county corruption, the rare earth deposit and its estimated value, which when reported in public made people do the same thing Elena had done when she first read it, which was read it again. The third part ran the day after Halden's arrest and covered the cooperating witness, the signal interception hardware, and a detailed account of what had happened on the ridge on the night of November 14th, with Gavin Cross named and quoted and described as he actually was, rather than as the narrative Halden's people had constructed. She sent him a text the morning the third part ran. It said, "Read it when you're ready, no rush." He read it that afternoon. Sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd sat after the late-night trespass 8 months ago and run scenarios, mapping exits and vulnerabilities. Now he sat at the same table and read his own story in someone else's words and felt the strange distance of that, the gap between living a thing and seeing it rendered in sentences. She'd gotten it right. That was the thing he hadn't been certain of. Not because he doubted her reporting, but because he'd never been the subject of reporting before, had always been on the side of things that didn't get reported, and he wasn't sure what it felt like to have your interior life approximated by someone who'd known you for 72 hours of extreme circumstances. She'd gotten it right, not perfect. There was a paragraph describing his military background that had a tone he wouldn't have chosen, but right in the ways that mattered. She hadn't made him a hero. She'd made him a person who made a decision and held to it under conditions designed to make holding to it impossible. He set his phone face down and looked at the window. He texted back, "You got it right." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Good." That was the job. He put the phone in his pocket and went to check on Kodiak. Okay, the federal hearings began in January. Gavin testified twice. The first session was in Denver, a closed preliminary hearing with federal prosecutors and investigators from 3 separate agencies, DOI, FBI, and a third agency whose name appeared in the documents, but whose role in the proceedings was never fully explained to him. Patricia sat beside him for 4 hours while he answered questions about the ridge, the structure, the equipment, the night of November 14th, the 18 months that preceded it. The second session was 6 weeks later, before a grand jury. He sat alone this time. Patricia was in the hallway outside, available but not permitted inside. And he answered questions for 2.5 hours. And when he came out, he had the specific drained quality of someone who had spoken more words about himself than he was comfortable with. "All right," Patricia said. "Yes." "You're not." "I'm functional." She looked at him over her glasses. "Grand juries are strange. You're telling your story to people who can't respond." "Combat debriefs are the same." She handed him a coffee she'd apparently gotten from somewhere during the 2.5 hours. He took it. "It'll go to trial," she said. "Probably fall, given the complexity of the indictment. You may testify again." "Fine." The DOI has formally blocked all mineral extraction applications on Silverpine Ridge pending a full environmental and legal review. That review will take 2 to 3 years. He looked at her. "And after the review?" "After the review, there's a regulatory process for any future applications, which would require your consent as the surface rights owner." She let that land. "It's a long road, but nobody is extracting anything from that ridge without going through you." He nodded. "One more thing," she said. "I've been contacted by a conservation land trust out of Boulder. They work with private landowners, voluntary conservation easements. You retain full ownership, full right of residence and use, but the development rights are permanently restricted." She watched his face. "No one can ever do to that land what Halden tried to do, not without reversing an easement that is, functionally, impossible to reverse." He held the coffee. He thought about the survey stake at the property line, the orange paint, the particular quality of the tree cover on the northeast face that he'd walked through in every season for 4 years, and that the satellites had never quite resolved clearly enough to show what was underneath. "Set up the meeting," he said. Patricia made a note. She did not say anything else about it, because she understood that some decisions didn't require a response beyond the decision itself. Elena came back to Harlan once, in late February. She drove up the service road, which had been formally repaired and properly graded by the county in December, in a development that Gavin attributed to the county commission's sudden, intense interest in not appearing to have historically favored Halden's interests, and parked in front of the cabin and sat in her car for a moment before getting out, in the way people sat in cars when they were preparing for something they hadn't entirely scripted. He was on the porch. Kodiak was beside him, standing on 4 legs, the left rear still slightly thickened at the joint, but functional. The vet's prediction of full recovery proving out over the weeks of careful rehabilitation. Ranger was somewhere in the tree line, doing whatever Ranger did when left to his own devices, which probably involved the systematic investigation of every animal trail on the property. Elena got out of the car. She was in better shape than the last time he'd seen her in person. The splint was gone, the color was back. The specific hollowed quality of someone running on emergency adrenaline had resolved into something more ordinary and sustainable. She looked like herself, whoever that was. He was still forming an opinion. She came up to the porch steps and stopped. "How's the leg?" she said. "Physical therapist says another 4 weeks. You're not using the crutches. The physical therapist doesn't live here." She almost smiled. She looked at Kodiak, who was looking at her with calm recognition. The dog remembered her, apparently, which Gavin thought said something because Kodiak was not an easy dog to impress. She held out her hand and the dog sniffed it and then turned away, which was Kodiak's version of an endorsement. "I'm going to D.C. next week," she said. "The Senate subcommittee that oversees DO1 is holding a hearing on the permit fraud, specifically on how a fraudulent application sat in review for 14 months without being formally acted on." She paused. "They've asked me to testify." "You should." "I know." She looked at the ridge. The February light was different from the November light, lower, whiter, the kind that made the snow look like something poured. "I also have an offer from a national outlet, not the Post, bigger. They want me to lead an investigative unit." She looked back at him. "Focus specifically on resource extraction and land rights." He looked at her. "Are you asking what I think?" "No," she said. "I'm telling you because—" She stopped. Because you're involved in this. Because your land is part of the story that created the opportunity. I thought you should know. Take it, he said. I already said yes. A beat. I just wanted to tell you in person. They stood with that for a moment. The mountain behind the cabin was clear in the morning light, the snow-covered ridge visible through the trees, every rock face and tree line he'd learned over 4 years present and accounted for, exactly where it had always been. There's something I never told you, he said. She waited. The night they left me in the snow, when I saw your headlights on the service road. He looked at his hands. The frostbite marks had faded to nothing. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know if you were another one of theirs, but I kept working the zip tie anyway. He paused. Because of the lights, just the existence of them, something moving toward the mountain instead of away from it. Elena was quiet. I don't know why I'm telling you that, he said. I do, she said. He looked at her. Because it matters that I came up the road, she said. And you've been thinking about why it matters. She looked at Kodiak again, then back at Gavin. It matters because you'd spent 18 months with everyone moving away from you. The sheriff, the county, the people in town, everyone calculating the distance between themselves and your problem. She paused. I moved toward it, that's all. He didn't say anything. He was not a man who filled silences that didn't need filling. She came up the last 2 porch steps and they shook hands, which was a slightly formal thing to do, and they both knew it and did it anyway, because some things between people who'd survived something together took a form that didn't quite fit any natural category. Stay in touch, she said. Yes. She went back to her car. He watched her drive back down the service road until the vehicle disappeared around the first bend. The dust didn't settle because everything was still frozen, but the road was empty again, and the mountain was quiet, and beside him Kodiak lay down on the porch boards with the slow, deliberate motion of a dog that was finally, genuinely at rest. The conservation easement was signed in March. Patricia drove up to witness it. The land trust attorney drove from Boulder, and they sat at the kitchen table where Gavin had drunk too much coffee and run too many scenarios in too many dark hours. And he signed his name to a document that made permanent what he'd always intended, that this land was not for sale, not for development, not for extraction, not for anyone who came up the service road with a briefcase and an offer, and the assumption that everything could be acquired if you applied sufficient pressure. The attorney, a woman in her 60s who'd done this work for 30 years, and had the quiet manner of someone who'd seen enough bad outcomes to understand what a good one looked like, set the signed copy on the table and said, "That's recorded with the county as of tomorrow morning. Permanent conservation easement in perpetuity." In perpetuity. The phrase had a weight to it. Not heavy, just solid. After the attorney left, Patricia sat at the table with the last of the coffee and looked at Gavin with the expression she used when she was about to say something she'd been sitting on for a while. "I owe you an honest thing," she said. He waited. "When you first came to see me, about the legal letters, I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought you were going to lose. I thought the practical thing was for you to sell at a favorable price and move on. I didn't say that because you didn't ask me for that opinion." She looked at her cup. "But I thought it." "I know you did," he said. She looked up. "Everyone thought it," he said. "That was the point. They built the whole thing on the assumption that if enough people believed I'd lose, I'd start believing it too." He shrugged. "I've been in situations where the odds were not in favor of the outcome I needed. The math isn't always the whole answer." Patricia sat with that for a moment. "You know what I think now?" she said. "What?" "I think your grandfather knew what was on this land, not the technical specifics. But he knew this was worth protecting, and he protected it the only way he could, which was by leaving it to someone who would fight for it." She paused. "I think he was right about you." Gavin looked out the window at the ridge. He'd never thought about it that way. His grandfather had been a quiet man, not unlike himself actually, when he looked at it squarely. A man who didn't explain himself much and didn't need others to explain themselves either, who'd built a life on a piece of land that most people thought wasn't worth the effort, and had done so without apparent concern for what most people thought. He didn't say anything for a while. "Thank you, Patricia," he said finally. She finished her coffee and stood up and put on her coat. I'll see you when the trial prep begins, which will be soon. I know. She drove away and he was alone again, which was not a problem. Spring came late to Silverpine Ridge that year, the last week of April before the snow in the shaded sections began to genuinely pull back, revealing the soil underneath, dark and wet and smelling of the particular mineral richness that he now understood differently than he had before. The creek ran loud and slightly red-tinted and constant, the way it always did in snowmelt, and the elk were back in the northeast valley, 3 cows and a spike bull moving through the clearing where the access roads had been graded and where now, after a DOI remediation order, the cleared sections were being revegetated with native species. Gavin was on the northeast face in early May when he found the place where the structure had been. The federal teams had removed everything and poured new concrete over the opening, and the rock face showed the seam, still visible if you knew where to look, and would show it for years. He stood in front of it and looked at it and felt not triumph exactly, but something in the neighborhood of resolution. The difference between a wound that's infected and a wound that's just healing. Still there. Not dangerous anymore. He sat on a rock in the morning light with both dogs beside him and looked out over the northeast valley at the elk moving through the revegetated clearing, and he thought about the man in the balaclava, and the temperature, and the things Halden had built, and what happened to things that were built on the assumption that everything had a price. Conrad Vale was cooperating with prosecutors and would serve a reduced sentence. The 2 county assessors had pled out. Braddock had resigned and was under separate investigation. Victor Halden was going to trial in September. His legal team was large and expensive and had filed 14 pretrial motions, most of which had been denied. His CFO had become the second cooperating witness in January. His personal assistant, 3 weeks after the arrest, had given a recorded statement to the FBI that apparently, according to Rachel Morrow at the Denver Post, who was now Elena's colleague, had the prosecutors describing it as corroborating every material claim. None of that required anything further from Gavin. He'd done his part. He'd testified and he'd signed the documents, and he'd cooperated with 3 separate agencies, and he'd shown up every time they'd asked him to, and he would show up again in September and say what he knew clearly and accurately and without embellishment, the way he'd been trained to report. But right now, in the early May morning, none of that was present. The mountain was present. The dogs were present. The elk in the valley below were present, moving through new growth in a clearing that had been prepared for something else entirely, and was now being reclaimed by the land itself, slowly and without drama, the way land reclaimed things. He stayed up there for a long time. When he finally started back toward the cabin, Kodiak moved ahead on 4 legs. All 4. The gait not quite what it had been before the surgery, but close enough to pass, close enough to function, close enough to run if running was required. Ranger ranged out to the right and vanished into the tree line and appeared again at a different angle and vanished again. The way he always did. The way he'd always do. The service road was visible through the lower trees, and beyond it the cabin, and beyond the cabin the ridge, and beyond the ridge the sky, which was the particular blue of high altitude in early May, the blue that doesn't exist at lower elevations, the blue that required you to be up here to see it. He'd been asked in 2 separate interviews, one by Elena for her 3rd piece, one by a radio journalist from Denver who'd wanted a longer conversation about the case, what he was going to do now. Both times he'd given the same answer, brief enough that one interviewer had asked him to elaborate and he'd declined. He was going to stay. Not because the land had turned out to be worth more than anyone realized, not because fighting for it had made him something, a symbol, the radio journalist had used that word, a symbol of resistance, and he'd looked at the journalist with the particular expression he reserved for words that substituted for understanding. He was going to stay because he'd always been going to stay. Because his grandfather had stayed. Because the 43 acres of Silverpine Ridge were 43 acres of Silverpine Ridge, and everything that had happened, the threats and the legal letters, and the night in the snow, and the months of grinding, sustained pressure designed to make a man doubt his own judgment, all of it had been in service of making him leave, and he had not left. And now he was still here on the mountain in the blue morning, and the land was still here around him, and that was the whole answer. The cabin came into sight through the trees. Smoke from the stove, because he'd banked the fire before coming out, and it was still going. And the smoke went straight up in the still air. No wind, Just the mountain in the morning and the smoke rising clean and vertical until it dispersed into the blue above. He went inside. He put more wood on the fire. He made fresh coffee and took it to the window and looked out at the ridge. Below him somewhere, Harlan was waking up. Patricia Deere was probably already in her office. Elena Voss was probably on a plane or making calls or doing the things she did, which was move toward the story rather than away from it. The federal trial was 4 months out. The conservation easement was recorded. The land trust had planted its first round of native revegetation on the northeast clearing. He drank his coffee. Kodiak came and lay at his feet, heavy and warm against his boot, and Ranger appeared from wherever Ranger went and positioned himself at the door, looking out, ears working, doing the job he'd always done because the job was what he was. Gavin Cross stood at the window of a cabin on a mountain that people had tried to take from him by every means available, and the mountain was still there, and he was still there, and the coffee was hot, and the fire was going, and the smoke went straight up into the clear spring sky. That was enough. It had always been enough. He just hadn't needed the world to understand that, until the world tried to take it from him. But the things worth protecting rarely